Good afternoon. Higher food, housing, utilities, fuel and transport prices have accelerated consumer inflation in August. Data from Statistics South Africa shows that CPI increased to 4.9% in August, up from 4.6% in July. The Consumer Price Index increased by 0.4% month-on-month in August. So the increases in the food category were driven largely by oil and fats and meat categories. Water and other services drove the housing and utilities category. The sizable fuel price increase in August also made a significant contribution to the transport category, with the price of petrol increasing by 91 cents per litre last month. The Reserve Bank expects inflation to average 4.3% this year, well within the central bank's target bracket of 3 to 6%. Let's get more on this. I'm joined by Professor Jannie Rossouw, who's the head at Wits Business School. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. So what are you expecting from the Monetary Policy Committee meeting tomorrow?
Good afternoon and good afternoon to the viewers. The inflation figures just been published. These are historic inflation figures, so therefore looking backwards. And of course, inflation targeting is a forward-looking policy, and the expectations are still that the rate of inflation will remain very close to 4.5%, the midpoint of the target range that the Reserve Bank targets at the moment. So therefore, my expectation is that the rate will stay unchanged.
Given how weak the South African economy is at the moment, when do you think we would be seeing interest hikes?
Well, we will see interest hikes when there's a clear indication of an acceleration in inflation. So as long as inflation remains subdued and inflation expectations remain anchored around 4.5%, there will be no need to increase interest rates. However, should this change, it will be necessary for the Reserve Bank to reconsider its stance. And this change can either be inflation below 4.5% and lower inflation expectations, or inflation above 4.5% and higher inflation expectations.
All right, can you just take us through what effect those protests that South Africa saw in July, as well as the strength of the rand and commodity prices, have on our growth and inflation outlook going forward?
Yeah, on the one hand, the growth outlook, the other hand, the inflation outlook. If we look at the growth outlook first, the unrest unfortunately dampened South Africa's growth outlook, if for no other reason that it made a long-term investment in South Africa less attractive. Investors do not like to invest in a country where you have things like unrest or other uncertainty. And then in terms of inflation, it increased costs in the economy, and cost increases inevitably we see reflected in price increases and therefore in the rate of inflation. I just want to add that in the latest inflation statistics, it's remarkable to see that the goods component of the inflation rate is considerably higher than the services component of the inflation rate. These two are moving away from one another. And it is unfortunately true that people are more aware of inflation in goods prices than inflation in services prices, and this can erode confidence in the historic inflation figures.
All right, Professor Rossouw, when we're speaking about people being aware of certain figures and others not, why should people who are watching care about these inflation figures and what's happening with them?
Well, in short, we should care about inflation because higher inflation in the future will result in stricter monetary policy, which will result in higher interest rates, and higher interest rates will impact negatively on those households and those businesses that borrowed large amounts of money.
Professor Jannie Rossouw, head of the Wits Business School, thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon.